Hi, I'm Ellen from the Chili Dog, and I'm getting ready to start another pair of my waffle cookie socks. These socks are worked from the toe up, and they have Japanese short row toes and heels. And there's two different ways you can do Japanese short rows. The pinned method, which uses a bunch of locking stitch markers, and the unpinned or catch method. They're really two paths to the same destination, and I'm going to be creating tutorials for both methods. And I'll divide those videos into the same sections so you can watch them side by side to compare the process if you like. In this video, we're going to be focusing on the unpinned or catch method of Japanese short rows. Before we begin, if you enjoy our videos, consider joining the pack and becoming a member of thechilidog.com for ad-free access to our entire learning library, priority support, and more. When you're casting on for a toe-up short row toe, you cast on your stitches using either a provisional or a double-sided cast on. Instead of the cast on happening here at the tip of the toe, the cast on is either placed at the base of the toe across the top of the sock or at the base of the toe across the bottom of the sock. And I prefer if my cast on stitches happen at the bottom of the sock. After I switch directions from working the toe one way and start working the foot in the opposite direction, inevitably, there is going to be a very slight tension irregularity across the cast on. If the cast on has happened across the bottom of the foot, nobody is going to see that except for me. If you're using a pattern, it will tell you how many turns there need to be on each side of the sock toe as you're working the first half of the toe shaping. And for my particular pattern, I'm going to need to have 11 turns on each side. If you're not working from a pattern, a good rule of thumb is about a third of your toe stitches in the center will be regular stitches, and you'll have turns at with about a third of the stitches on each side. To get started with the first right side row, I'm just going to knit across my toe stitches until I get to one stitch before the end of the toe. Since I'm not using any pins or locking stitch markers, turning the first right side row is quick and easy. All I need to do is turn my work over to the other side, slip my first stitch purlwise, and then I can continue and just purl across until I get to one stitch before the end of the toe. To turn my first wrong side row, again, I'm simply going to turn my work over to the other side and slip that first stitch purlwise. Before I knit my next row, let's take a look at something. Down here, there is a noticeable gap where that first stitch was slipped. I want to knit across till I'm one stitch before this next gap. I've knit to one stitch before the next gap. So to turn my remaining right side rows, I'm just going to turn my work over, slip a stitch, and then purl across until I'm one stitch before this next gap. I've purled to one stitch before my gap. So to turn my wrong side row, I'm simply going to turn my work over and slip a stitch purlwise. So I'll continue working like that, where on the right sides, I'll knit to one stitch before the next gap, and then turn my work over and slip a stitch, and then purl to one stitch before the gap and turn my work over and slip a stitch until I have the number of gaps or turns as are indicated in my pattern. So in my case, I'll have 11 gaps on each side of my sock toe. I've completed purling across my final wrong side row. So now I just need to make my final wrong side turn. So I'll turn my work over and then slip that first stitch purlwise. And now I have 11 gaps on one side of my sock toe and 11 gaps on the other side of my sock toe. So the first half of my toe shaping is complete, and this is the part that's going to be at the bottom of my foot. And it's time for me to work the second half of the toe shaping, which will be across the top of the foot. This time, each one of my short rows is going to be one stitch longer than the last, and I'm going to be closing up all of these gaps at the sides of the sock. To get started with the first right side row, I'm going to knit all the way to the first gap. As I'm closing up this first right side gap, I'm going to think of the columns of stitches that are on my right needle as generations. So the child stitches on my needle, below it is the parent, then the grandparent and great grandparent, and so on. To close the gap, I need to find the bar on the wrong side of my work that when I pull on it, it tightens up this parent stitch. And I'll knit that horizontal bar together with the next stitch on my needle. To find that bar, I have to turn things over to the wrong side of my work. So again, I'm looking for the horizontal bar that's going to tighten up this parent stitch right here. So if I take my right hand needle under this bar, when I pull on that bar, it's going to tighten up that parent stitch. So that is the correct bar that I need to use to close the gap. So it's on my needle. I'm going to turn things over to the other side. And before I knit these two stitches together, I need to make sure that my lifted strand has a conventional stitch mount because right now it's reversed. The right hand leg of the stitch is at the back and the left hand leg is at the front. I just need to turn that stitch around so that the right hand leg is at the front and the stitch has a conventional stitch mount. Then I can knit it together with that next stitch. As I'm knitting those two stitches together, notice something. My right needle goes through the stitch and then the lifted strand. That's important so that you get a nice tight closure as you're working the stitches that close the gaps together. Once I've worked my stitches together, I can turn my work over, and then I'm going to purl across until I get to the next gap on the other side of the sock. As I'm closing the first wrong side gap, again, I'll close the gap by working the horizontal bar that tightens up the parent stitch together with the next stitch. So first, let's identify where that horizontal bar is. So here's my child stitch, here's the parent, and here is the horizontal strand that when I pull on it, it tightens up that parent stitch. So that's the horizontal strand I need to use. Before I lift it up though, we need to remember that as I'm purling this strand and this stitch together, I need to go through the stitch and then the lifted strand. To do that, I am going to actually slip the stitch over first before I lift up that horizontal strand. Then I can lift the horizontal strand. This time the stitch is already mounted conventionally with the right leg of the stitch at the front and the left leg at the back. So I don't need to turn anything around. I'll return my slipped stitch to my left needle, and then I can purl the stitch and lifted strand together to close the gap and then turn things over to the other side. Now I'll knit across to my next gap. As I close my remaining right side gaps, you'll notice that now the gap is taller than that very first one. And that's because I've added 2 gap closing rows from the previous gap. So this time, to close the gap, I need to work the horizontal strand that tightens up the great grandparent together with the next stitch. So again, to identify that horizontal strand that's going to tighten up the great grandparent stitch, I need to turn things over to the wrong side so I can find it. So here's my child stitch on the needle, the parent stitch below it, the grandparent below that, and then this long great grandparent stitch. I'll identify the horizontal strand. It's going to tighten up that great grandparent stitch. And it's right there. So when I pull on that strand, the great grandparent gets smaller. Turn the work over. The stitch that I lifted has a reverse stitch mount. So the right leg of the stitch is at the back and the left leg is at the front. I need to just turn that lifted stitch around so that it has a conventional stitch mount. So I'll just slip it and turn and then return it. So now the right leg of the stitch is at the front of the needle, the left leg is at the back, and I can knit those 2 stitches together. That closes the gap. I'll turn things over and purl across to my next gap on the other side. To close the wrong side gap, again, I need to work the horizontal bar that tightens up the great grandparent stitch together with the next stitch. So first, let's identify that horizontal bar. So here's the child, the parent, the grandparent, that elongated great grandparent. We'll find the horizontal bar right here that when I pull on it, it tightens up that great grandparent stitch on the side. But before I work it together with the next stitch, I need to reverse their order. So I'm carefully just going to slip my next stitch over to the right needle, lift up that bar that tightens up the great grandparent. The stitch mount is naturally going to be a conventional stitch mount. So the right leg of the stitch is at the front of the needle. The left leg of the stitch is at the back of the needle. I'll return my slipped stitch over to my left needle. And then purl the slipped stitch and the lifted bar together. And the gap is closed up, and I'll turn things over and continue knitting across to a gap, closing it, then purling across to the next gap and closing it until all of the gaps on each side of my sock toe have been closed. As I'm closing up my final wrong side gap, I'd like to show you one more option that you can use for manipulating these stitches. So again, I'm going to start by identifying that horizontal bar that closes up the great grandparent stitch and lifting that up onto my left needle. It's right here. And now I need to reverse the order of these two stitches. So instead of dropping this lift off and then slipping and then lifting that bar again, instead this time I'm going to take my right hand needle, go behind the stitches and through the next stitch. I use my thumb to kind of hold those two stitches in place, pull the left needle completely out, and then reinsert it just into the lifted strand. Slip the stitch on my left needle or on my right needle back to the left and then purl them together. It accomplishes the exact same thing. It's just a different way of maneuvering your stitches around. So once I've purled those final two stitches together and closed that last gap, I can turn things over and my toe is complete. So these stitches that I've worked across here are at the top of my toe. Let's zoom out so we can look at the big picture. The stitches I've been working across at the top of the toe. My held stitches from the cast on that were either held on knitting needles or on the cord of a knitting needle or maybe on a piece of waste yarn is the bottom of my toe. And I'm ready now to start working the foot of the sock in rounds around all of those stitches. I hope you enjoyed learning how to knit a toe up Japanese short row toe using the catch method. If you'd like to try this technique in a pattern, head over to the shop section of thechilidog.com and look for my waffle cookie socks. Until we stitch again, happy knitting!